So 2 years ago when we introduced the Hightower 3, we said that it was the absolute best mountain bike for mountain biking. Yeah, that's right. Santa Cruz has always positioned the Hightower as the bike that can do everything and put a smile on your face while it does it. So for anybody looking for a bike that can absolutely hit every trail on the mountain, this is the place to start. Stick with us after the break, and we're gonna break down all of the details about the brand new Hightower 4. All right, welcome back. If you stuck with us through the break, you want to learn more about the brand new Hightower. And to talk about it, let's bring in a special guest, the captain of the Mike's Bikes Enduro team, Justin Mimi.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Of course, man. I think probably the best way to introduce you is probably just throw to a little bit of you riding. Let's see it. All right, so it's pretty clear that Justin can ride a bike pretty darn well. So let's talk about all of the details that go into the brand new Hightower. Justin, your first bike was a Hightower, right?
My first carbon mountain bike was a first generation Hightower.
And it's come a pretty long way. It's now a completely different travel length. It's much slacker, much longer. What's the riding experience like in between the two?
Night and day. In the past 7-8 years, the bike has gone through so many refinements. It's so much different now, longer, slacker, and more capable.
All right, so Santa Cruz calls this the most versatile bike in their line, and the new version has 150 millimeters of rear VPP travel in the back. That's up from 145 millimeters with the previous model, and it's got 160 millimeters of travel up front. This bike has 29-inch wheels only, so no MX options. It's also pretty darn light. Our Exo Axis Reserve bike comes in around 33.5 pounds, and so you'll see a varied range of weights all across the different models. And like you would expect, it's got a host of other features, everything from internal storage to the ability to have a coil shock and all sorts of other bits and bobs. So Justin, you've been on the bike for about a week. You've had a chance to ride it out on the trails, and that means you've also gotten to set the bike up to you. So how is the process of getting everything put up to your weight and spec?
Yeah, initially it took about 10-15 minutes to set the bike up, and I basically just copy and pasted my previous settings from Hightowers I'd ridden in the past. And let me tell you, that didn't work as expected. The bike is different. You can tell riding it, it still feels like a Santa Cruz, but it's definitely got some suspension changes. It's apparent looking at the bike, it's different, and rightfully so. What I will say is that I've ran less pressure on this bike than I've ran in the past, and I found that it was more supple, but also more supportive. In an era of refinement in mountain bikes, it's weird to say those things, but I definitely feel like this bike checks all those boxes.
All right, so the setup of the bike was a little different than previous models, but let's talk a little bit further about the suspension. I feel like suspension is the big thing that Santa Cruz has been talking about on this. They have adjusted the suspension pretty substantially, and they're calling this their 4th generation of VPP, with the goal of improving the bike's anti-squat. For those of you that don't know, anti-squat is the bike's ability to resist pedaling input into the suspension. If you go too far, the bike will end up being too stiff and won't be able to soak up bumps at the beginning of the stroke. And if you don't go far enough, the bike is going to wallow and bounce as you get on top of the pedals. If you want to go a little more in depth on what anti-squat is, I actually think Pink Bike has done a really good job of outlining all of this in a very sciencey article on the website. We'll throw that down in the description below. The way that Santa Cruz has approached this is by adjusting the location of the shock. They've moved it a little further down and a little further forward, which helps give a better leverage ratio so that the first part of the stroke is much more supple. In turn, it gives you that nice beginning of the stroke, but you still got a lot of support as you get into it. Santa Cruz calls that a more mature ride quality. But Justin, you've had the bike out on the trails, so how does it actually feel on different terrain? You've got a test track that you like to go out to have some consistency when you ride a new bike. What is the track like, and how does it ride on it?
Test track is chunky, pedally, but also fast. On this bike, when I stood up and put the pedals down, I didn't feel like there was anything different with the anti-squat, but it was those consecutive hits in the rock garden that really showed. This bike still stays composed, but it felt more supple, and it was just a bit easier to keep my line.
What about, this is not an incredibly long bike. You race a lot of enduro stuff. So how does this amount of suspension, 150 millimeters in the rear, how does that stand up to, repeated impacts?
I felt like 150 was enough. It felt supple, but also compliant. It didn't feel like I was getting jostled around, that it was any hindrance. I definitely think that this bike could be used also as an enduro race bike with just a little bit more finesse and setup.
What about, is there any terrain maybe that you took it on that it felt like not enough bike for?
Not yet. Nope, not yet.
So it seems like it does a pretty good job of handling most of the chunk that you find on everyday trails. Maybe it's not something that you're going to run on a full downhill track, but at the same time, it does a great job of handling most things. What about on the climb, if you got to get back to the top of the hill?
Yeah, I felt like this bike climbed really well at around 33 pounds. It wasn't too heavy. I would like to put on some thicker tires, so maybe that'll hinder the climbing performance, but overall it felt really efficient. The VPP platform was really solid and stable under pedaling, and I actually was surprised that there was very little pedal bob.
So next up, let's talk a little bit about the geometry. The geometry of the new Hightower is not a complete revolution. Altogether, it's pretty similar. It's a little longer, it's a little slacker, but nothing too crazy.
I do agree, nothing crazy, but in this instance, millimeters matter. And longer, lower, and slacker is the way things are moving.
You're right, so millimeters do matter. Let's talk a little bit about what the actual numbers of the bike are, and let's start with the head tube. In the high setting, the Hightower is going to come in at 64.2 degrees, and in its low setting, you're going to see at 63.9 degrees. Altogether, that's about a half a degree slacker than the previous Generation 3. So you do get a little bit slacker front end, but altogether, pretty right in the middle for where a trail bike should be. In terms of reach, we do get a little extra reach here. It goes from 475 with the previous generation out to 480 in a size large. The rear center has also expanded ever so slightly. You still get the chain stays that are expanding depending on the size that you've got, but now you're gonna see about 2 millimeters longer depending on the size. As for the seat tube angle, you're gonna see that be about 78 degrees across the whole size range, a little steeper than you saw with the previous model. All right, so all those numbers have to mean something, which is how the bike actually handles on the trail. So in your experience, let's talk first maybe about like high speed and high consequence. Like where is a place that you had the bike up to speed and how does it handle once you're going through fast stuff?
Yeah, being that it's longer, lower, and slacker, it just felt like I was inside the bike. So on a trail that I ride often, it's called Coyote Track, you get up to about 30 miles an hour. Being inside the bike, having a bit more of that rear center makes you feel like you're more inside the bike and just more confidence inspiring, really. It feels like you have more control, you can go faster, push harder, and it's just gonna support you.
What about once you get the bike into maybe some chunkier terrain? Does it feel like the suspension is soaking up the bumps or is it bucking you off and would you rather have more travel?
I feel like the suppleness of the V4 VPP is definitely, it helps with line tracking, but I will say that the way that they have the shock tuned, it doesn't feel like when you do hit those big compressions that you're getting jarred or you're getting tossed around. It feels composed overall and really confidence inspiring once again.
So the other end of the spectrum from the high speed, high consequence stuff comes back into maybe the technical things where you're trying to pick a line in slower sections. It's slacker, it's longer. All those things would typically mean the bike isn't going to handle as well. How does it handle in those shorter, smaller situations?
Yeah, I feel like if you are a rider who gears towards that, you definitely want to ride this bike in high, which is going to steepen up the head tube angle just a little bit. But I feel like that's kind of the caveat these days, is if your bike is getting longer, lower, and slacker, it's going to be a little bit more cumbersome and coming into those technical lines, technical climbs. So you just have to be a little bit better about picking your lines and pedaling when appropriate.
I think Santa Cruz is pretty known for how their bikes feel. Does this still feel within the family?
Definitely. Still feels like a Santa Cruz when you hop on it. It doesn't feel drastically different right off the bat, but when you start riding on the trail, then you realize there's something special going on.
All right, so let's close this thing out. We've talked a lot about the features of the Hightower, the adjustments to the suspension, the geometry. We've talked about how it rides on trail, but we haven't talked about who the actual rider is. With your little time on the bike, what do you think? Who's going to benefit from it?
I'd say anyone who has a large variety of trails. They're going to have long uphills, but they're also going to have chunky downhills. This bike is going to go big, small, and everything in between.
It is truly the jack of all trades. All right, so that is it. That is the 4th generation of Hightower, Santa Cruz's latest bike into the trail category. It was one of our favorites. It's always been a really good seller in the stores. If you've got any questions about it, feel free to drop them down below, or you can always reach out to anybody in the stores or stop by if you want to get a test ride. Justin, as always, thank you for being on the road, flying the Enduro banner, and thank you for coming and joining us.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
See you on the next one.